Social Studies 20 here, taking a look now at Japanese ultranationalism. Um, in this case, it will culminate with obviously expansionist policies that we've already learned, but also genocide in the 1930s, ethnic cleansing in the 1930s. Very quick, brief background. A lot of this is review. Japan, as you probably know, had long been an isolationist country empire before the 1800s. And so what that meant was that the rest of the world had modernized, had gone through the Industrial Revolution, but Japan didn't. And so Japan awakens to the reality by the late 1800s that the rest of the world has moved on, and they haven't. And so there was a push for what is known as rapid industrialization, the catching up of Japan to the rest of the world, or at least Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere. This was also coupled with the population explosion. So as nations industrialize, they increase their ability to feed their population. So you get a population boom. More kids are living past the age of 2, and populations usually explode. And so with all of that in mind, Japan needed more resources. They've got to feed their burgeoning population. You can't industrialize without resources. So to get resources, Japan being a big island, is going to have to take them from someone else. And so, as early as the late 1800s and early 1900s, Japan was involved in a series of conflicts before we even get to World War II. The Sino-Japanese War was a war between Japan and China, and the Russo-Japanese War, a war between Japan and Russia. Emperor at the time was Emperor Hirohito. So that is the setting for Japan at the dawn of the 20th century. Um, a strong militaristic country that was looking to rapidly industrialize and needed resources was going to have to take them from somebody else. Shintoism plays a big hand, a very big role in Japanese ultranationalism. It was the state religion of Japan. And what Shintoism basically said was that the emperor of Japan, in this case Hirohito, was a living, breathing god who demanded loyalty and allegiance to the country. So, as a Japanese citizen, you were not there for you. You were there to serve the emperor, the empire of Japan. When we take Shintoism to the extreme, you can see how it could be used as a justification of Japanese superiority over other Asian peoples. And now you can figure in your greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It's Japan's duty to rule and dominate Asia um, um, to meet their own ends. State Shintoism. And so, with all of those things in mind, Japan began its expansionist policies in the early 1930s, and we've already learned this, but very quickly again, in 31, they invade Manchuria, China. In 37, they invade China again in the Second Sino-Japanese War. The justification for this war being that if Japan didn't invade first, China was certainly going to declare war and invade Japan. That was ludicrous. That was not going to happen, but they wanted to advertise the invasion of China as a war of defense. Brings to mind that piece of propaganda we just interpreted recently, where the Japanese tanks were rolling over someone else's defenses. That could very well have been the Sino-Japanese War. Um, so, quite often, countries will market their aggression as a war of defense to rationalize what they're doing, what they're about to do, what they're calling upon their people to do. Germany did it, of course, Japan did it. When it wasn't really, it was Japanese aggression. Asia for Asians, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And eventually these expansionist policies would bring them to bomb Pearl Harbor in 1941, which, as you know, drew the Americans into the conflict, World War II, and that ended very badly for Japan by 1945, as we learned, due to, the American military firebombing the atomic bombs. Japan lost World War II by August of 1945. Rape of Nanking. This was the genocide, the ethnic cleansing that I was mentioning earlier. A lot of people don't know this, but over about 6 weeks in 1937, just after the invasion of China at the city of Nanking. Japanese propaganda had for decades been dehumanizing Chinese civilians to the point that when Japanese soldiers arrive in Nanking in 1937, they're not really looking at the Chinese civilians as people. They'd been dehumanized by the government due to propaganda, and some soldiers went on a rampage where they murdered 300,000 Chinese civilians. There were thousands of war rapes. There were mutilations. It's a separate lesson we'll look at later on. There's a video that goes with it. It's actually quite disturbing. Most people aren't aware of the rape of Nanking, but hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered at the hands of Japanese soldiers. The soldiers went on a rampage of war rape. There were thousands of rapes to go along with the civilian dead. Bodies were mutilated. Um, I don't want to describe it much more than that. We'll watch the documentary later, um, and it was met with an immediate Japanese denial. The rape of Nanking. So it serves as a good example of ultranationalism and genocide and ethnic cleansing. That ultranationalism will obviously lead to things like war, things like conflict, but also mass murder, as we see in the rape of Nanking.